person you're looking at is Evan Mercer. At this moment, he is being questioned by investigators after the building's entire repair.
I didn't take a dime.
Paper trail was torn apart during a residents' meeting because $203,000 from the reserve fund disappeared in a way no one could still call an accounting mistake.
All 18 of these invoices came from the same IP address. I sent them for the vendor, that's all.
But to understand how it got here, we have to go back to the beginning. And before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more cases like this. Evan Mercer, 43, was the property manager of a 58-unit condo building in Brooklyn, New York. To the people who lived there, he was not the likable type. Evan was cold, neat, quiet, and almost never let anyone see him rattled. But that was exactly what made him seem trustworthy. To residents, especially those who did not understand maintenance systems, finances, vendors, and piles of technical paperwork in an aging New York building, Evan looked like the kind of man who always knew what he was doing. When the boiler had problems, he said he would handle it. When the roof leaked, he said he had already called the vendor. When the intercom stayed dead for weeks, he kept that same calm tone, as if all of it were just temporary disruptions that would be cleaned up with one more email, one more phone call, one more invoice. That is also what made this case stand out. Over a span of 22 months, Evan was accused of fabricating 18 fake invoices for boiler work, roof repairs, and intercom maintenance, then using them to pull a total of $203,000 from the Condo Association's reserve fund. That money did not come from some large corporation or some distant budget. It came from this community's own safety net, from fees that 58-unit owners paid in with the belief that if the heating system died in the middle of winter, if the roof failed, if the front entry no longer worked, the building would still have a financial cushion to save itself. And when that money vanished, the consequences did not just show up on bank statements. They showed up in freezing apartments for 9 straight days, in 14 elderly residents forced to stay with relatives, and in 6 weeks of a dead intercom that made everyone walk downstairs to open the door like they were living in a building that had been abandoned. This was not the kind of case with a multi-million-dollar number meant to shock. It was more disturbing for a different reason. It was small enough to feel ordinary, plausible enough that no one wanted to believe they were being cheated. And it did not collapse because of some dramatic audit. It collapsed because of one tiny detail that almost slipped past everyone. A delivery signature signed Mike, even though the vendor confirmed they had no technician by that name. Evan Mercer was born in Queens, into a working-class family with nothing especially remarkable about it. According to people who knew him years earlier, he was never loud, never the kind of young man who drew attention when he walked into a room. He observed more than he spoke, learned to read situations quickly, and had a particular talent for making people believe that handing him a problem would be easier than dealing with it themselves. Before he became a property manager, Evan worked as a maintenance coordinator for a cluster of rental buildings in South Brooklyn. It was not glamorous work, but it gave him something much more valuable, an understanding of how systems really function when the people who rely on them cannot see behind the curtain. He knew how vendors sent invoices. He knew when board packets were usually assembled. He knew that during a board meeting, people were most likely to say yes when they heard words like urgent, safety, winter, insurance exposure, or if we don't approve this now, the cost will go up. He also understood something even more important. In small and mid-sized condo buildings, board members usually have full-time jobs elsewhere. They are not engineers, they are not auditors. They are people with families, jobs, and bills of their own, and all they really want is for the person they hired to manage the building to do his job properly. Over the years, Evan built the image of someone efficient, quiet, unflashy, and extremely capable. He arrived early, dressed cleanly, remembered residents' faces, replied to emails in short, decisive language. Sometimes he even appeared in the lobby while vendors were supposedly working, just to create the sense that everything was under control. In a Brooklyn neighborhood undergoing gentrification, where maintenance costs kept rising and residents constantly worried that the building's financials would drag down property values, someone like Evan was easy to trust. He did not need to be warm. He only needed to make people feel that without him, things would be worse. No one expected a man who understood the system that well to exploit it. But sometimes the most dangerous person is not the openly greedy one. It is the one patient enough to look like the most effective employee in the room, while quietly hollowing the place out from the inside. To understand this case, you first have to understand how a condo reserve fund works. On paper, it is a pool of money set aside for big, expensive repairs, central heating, roof waterproofing, security equipment, intercom systems, anything that, if it fails, the entire building will feel immediately. It is different from the monthly operating budget. It is not for cleaning hallways or replacing light bulbs. It exists to save the building at exactly the worst possible moments. Normally, when something breaks, the property manager contacts the vendor, gets a quote or an invoice, sends the paperwork to the board, and recommends payment. For urgent repairs, that process often moves faster than usual, and that is where the weakness appears, because when a boiler dies in the middle of a New York winter, and nobody on the board wants to be the person who delayed action, the person blamed, the person who forced the whole building to stay cold 3 extra days just because they wanted one more piece of paper. The next weakness is that everything looks legitimate when you examine each piece by itself. One invoice can look reasonable. One email claiming a vendor is delayed on materials can sound reasonable too. A rushed payment for resident safety sounds even more reasonable. But when one person controls the flow of information between the board, the vendors, and the payment paperwork, that person can almost decide what others see and what they never see. Evan understood that better than anyone. He knew the board did not call vendors directly every time an invoice came in. He knew many board members skimmed documents right before meetings. He knew technical language and urgency could blur the instinct to doubt. And most importantly, he understood community psychology. In a condo building, people fear disorder. They fear scandal. They fear falling property values. They fear internal conflict. They fear admitting that they trusted the wrong person. Evan did not need to steal big right away. He only needed to position himself between people's exhaustion, their busy lives, and their reluctance to face chaos head-on. After that, the system did the rest, making everything look normal. At first, it was just a small amount compared to what would come later. A boiler component repair invoice was pushed through as a late winter emergency expense, small enough that no one wanted to drag out a meeting by studying every line. It sat within the range everyone thought was believable, a number that did not shock anyone, a repair issue that sounded real, a short explanation in an email, and a nod of approval. Nothing happened after that. No one called the vendor back to verify it. No one checked maintenance logs. No one asked for field photos. The payment went through so smoothly that the silence itself may have taught Evan the most important lesson of all. Here, if something sounds plausible and annoying enough that people do not want to dig deeper, it will slide through. After that first time, he became more sophisticated. Evan did not jump straight to large numbers. He tested the system's response by slipping in invoices with increasingly similar structures, always wrapped in familiar situations. Replacing a sensor, checking lines, dealing with water intrusion, resetting the intercom, after-hours technician call fees. He began changing vendor payment information in transfer paperwork. He started sending documents right before board meetings, when people only had enough energy left to ask the one question that mattered most. If we don't approve this now, is it dangerous? Then he discovered something even more useful than paperwork weaknesses. He discovered how short a community's memory can be when people are constantly living through the next problem. Today, it is the roof. Next week, it is the intercom. The week after that, it is rising insurance costs. One issue quickly covers up the last one. That allowed Evan to create a constant fog. Each invoice was just one slice of a picture that nobody ever stepped far enough back to see in full. By the middle of the second year, the amounts grew faster, not in a flashy way, but in a more confident way. The invoices got heavier, larger, closer together. Boiler, roof, intercom, then the boiler again. Each problem was serious enough that no one wanted to hesitate. And each one was framed by Evan in exactly the language hardest for the board to resist. If we delay, the costs go up. If we delay, insurance may raise questions. If we delay, residents will be furious. If we delay, winter will arrive before the vendor can come back. Later tracing of the money showed that the funds pulled from the reserve account did not sit in one obvious place like a clumsy embezzlement scheme. They were split up, softened, and moved into expenses mundane enough that they did not immediately suggest a sudden life of luxury. Evan did not buy a supercar, and he did not wear an obviously expensive watch. That made him more dangerous, not less. He used the money to patch holes in his private life, credit card debt, the rent on a newer apartment above his income level, a leased car, weekends away from Brooklyn, personal transactions that, seen individually, did not scream that this was money stolen from a community reserve fund. And in front of everyone, he remained the same Evan. Still walking the halls with a folder under his arm. Still saying the vendor was on the way. Still reminding the board that old buildings never run smoothly. Still repeating the same line. I'll handle it with the vendor. What is chilling is that he did not need to perform much. He only needed to repeat the role until it became part of the environment. Once a community gets used to seeing you as the person who manages crises, it takes them much longer to accept that you are the crisis. By the end of the 22-month period, a total of $203,000 had been pulled from the reserve fund. And by then, the building was not just poor on paper. It had begun to decay in real life. The boiler really failed. The intercom really died. The very things Evan once used as excuses came back as physical consequences he could no longer hide. Things started to shift after the prolonged cold spell that left the boiler down for 9 days. Younger residents could grit their teeth, buy a space heater, pile on blankets. But for elderly residents who had lived there for years, this was no longer an inconvenience. It was real risk. One older woman said in a meeting that she had slept in her coat for 3 nights in a row. Another had to stay with her daughter because her unit was no longer warm enough. That was the moment residents' anger stopped revolving around whether management was merely incompetent. It turned directly toward the money. If the reserve fund still existed, why was everything failing this badly? The first red flag was the contradiction between paperwork and reality. The record said the boiler had already undergone multiple repairs, but the system still died in the middle of winter. The intercom had repeated maintenance invoices attached to it, but the building still could not buzz people in remotely for 6 weeks. Even people who normally paid little attention to documents started sensing something was wrong because they were living inside the evidence of that mismatch every day. The second red flag came from the documents themselves. One board member noticed that 18 invoices, supposedly from different vendors, looked disturbingly alike. Same font style, same rhythm in the job descriptions, same punctuation habits, even the same shorthand errors. It was not the kind of thing that jumps out immediately. But once someone saw it, they could not stop seeing it. The third red flag was the missing material. No completion paperwork. No permit closeout. No before and after photos. For work involving boilers and roofs in New York, missing completion records are not a small oversight. They are a black hole. The fourth red flag was the reserve fund statements. Always late. Always attached to a different explanation, but leading to the same result. The board never had full numbers in hand when it needed to vote. And the fifth red flag, perhaps the most important one, was how Evan reacted when he was pressed harder. He did not explode. He did not run. He just became smoother, more technical, more fluent, making every question sound like an obstacle, slowing down a process that was already urgent. That was when some people on the board started to realize maybe they were not just dealing with a bad manager. Maybe they were looking at someone who was used to controlling the pace of suspicion inside the room. The real breaking point came during a late-night ground floor meeting. Cold white LED lights. A long table covered in invoices. Residents packed shoulder to shoulder against the walls. The atmosphere no longer felt like a board meeting. It felt like a community confrontation. The board was being forced to explain why it had just asked 58 owners to pay a $3,500 special assessment per unit, while the building was still cold, still dysfunctional, still looking like nothing had ever truly been repaired. One board member demanded that Evan put every invoice, work order, delivery receipt, and completion record on the table. Not later, not next week, right then. As the papers were flipped one by one, a delivery receipt related to the boiler job showed a signature. Mike. Just a scribbled name. A detail small enough that in another meeting, in another room, nobody might have bothered to read it. But that night, someone did. The board called the vendor listed on the paper. The phone was put on speaker. The room went quiet. And on the other end, the vendor representative said something short, cold, and clear. They did not have any technician named Mike. And they had not issued the stack of invoices lying on the table. From that moment on, this was no longer suspicion. It was a scene. After the meeting, the board hired people to review the digital trail. Metadata on the PDF files showed that many of the invoices had been created or modified from the same device. Email logs showed they did not originate from an outside vendor system the way Evan claimed. Instead, they tied back to the network inside the management office. ACH and wire records showed that vendor payment details had been altered before payment went out. Reordered reserve fund bank statements revealed the pattern clearly. Documents inserted into board packets just before meetings, always justified as urgent, followed by money moving out quickly. Finally, internal access logs confirmed that many of those files had been added using Evan's own login credentials on the exact days the board was pressured to approve emergency payments. Any one piece alone might still have been arguable. Put together, the picture offered almost no room left to escape. A few weeks after the review began, the file had grown thick enough to be handed over to the city's financial investigators. On the morning of March 12, 2024, police and investigators arrived at the management office where Evan was still working as if it were any other normal day. No chase, no smashed doors, no movie-style shouting,